HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The File, Origins of the Munich Massacre, by San Charles Haddad. Read by Paul Boehmer. Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, verses 11 through 12. I have further observed under the sun that the race is not won by the swift, nor the battle by the valiant, nor is bread won by the wise, nor wealth by the intelligent, nor favor by the learned. For the time of mischance comes to all. And a man cannot even know his time. As fishes are enmeshed in a fatal net, and as birds are trapped in a snare, so men are caught at the time of calamity, when it comes upon them without warning. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it, and everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest, when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. Surah al-Hadid, Surah 57, verse 20. Know that the life of the world is only play, and idle talk and pageantry, and boasting among you, and rivalry in respect of wealth and children, as the likeness of vegetation after rain, whereof the growth is pleasing to the husbandman, but afterward it drieth up, and thou seest it turning yellow, then it becometh straw. And in the hereafter there is grievous punishment, and also forgiveness from Allah and his good pleasure, whereas the life of the world is but matter of illusion. Preface. Context and background. 1. Sports will not make angels of brutes, but there is a great possibility that they will temper that brutality, giving the individual a bit of self-control. That at least is something. So wrote Pierre de Coubertin, the spiritual founder of the modern Olympic Games, in early 1935. But what if the brute were not an athlete? Adolf Hitler, the fascist dictator of the new Germany, certainly was not the sporting type. He was more on the pathway to becoming a demon. Hitler did not waste time philosophizing the values of sport. While an ailing Coubertin, died 1937, was writing commentary for a Belgian sport newspaper, Hitler was focused on bringing to fruition his aspirations for a new German empire. The creation of his Third Reich would bring about the deaths of tens of millions between September 1939 and May 1945. Hitler's priorities were exhibited in some of the key strategic policy benchmarks that he achieved during the raging debate on whether to withdraw the Olympic hosting rights from Germany after the Nazis seized full control of the country on January 30th, 1933. These benchmarks included the Enabling Act, March 1933, which gave Hitler the right to pass laws without the approval of the German parliament; the Reichskonkordat, July 1933, in which the Vatican consented to the restriction of the German clergy's political activity; the reintegration of the Saar region into the territory of Germany, January 1935, his massive rearmament campaign and reintroduction of conscription, March 1935, introduction of the anti-Semitic and racial Nuremberg laws, September 1935, and the remilitarization of the Rhineland, March 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which had formalized the end of the First World War. This is the national context in Germany in the lead-up to the Berlin Games that influenced the behaviors and decisions of this book's protagonists and other characters. The fate and values of Coubertin's cherished Olympic movement hung in the balance. So did the lives of European Jews. The Nazis assumed full control of Germany on January 30th, 1933. In doing so, they inherited the hosting rights of the Games of the 11th Olympiad. The Nazis' actions, versus words, made it clear that Jews were not welcome at the Games. Arguments raged in the American Olympic Association, among worldwide socialists and communists, and within global Jewry. These arguments presented the very real threat that the Games might be boycotted. For Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, there would be no boycott. He was determined to make the Games one of his greatest propaganda successes. Indeed, 300 million people around the world would eventually tune in on the radio to follow the Games, and what a success they were. Despite their dark undertones, these Games established benchmarks to which the modern Olympic festival still adheres, the most famous, and ironic, of which is the torch that carries the Olympic flame, the symbol of the Olympic truce, from ancient Olympia in Greece to the host stadium. Today, the Nazi Olympics are often remembered as the Games that should have been boycotted, but were not. Nazi ideology was an affront to the internationalist, peaceful mission of the Olympic movement. So how could the International Olympic Committee, IOC, and its associated national Olympic committees rubber stamp the Nazi regime? This regime's intent was to break rather than fortify the links between the Olympic rings. In fact, Spain did boycott, but its decision was not purely out of principle against the Nazis or because the country's politicians favored the Olympic ideals. The country's leftist government was interested in using sport for its own propaganda in support of leftist causes. It organized the People's Olympiad in Barcelona as a leftist demonstration against the Olympics in Berlin. Those Games never took place because of the Spanish Civil War. But there was one small country that actually took the final public stand against Berlin: Palestine. This is the story of the first Palestine Olympic Committee, which existed from 1930 until 1948, and was the supreme Olympic authority in the territory administered during the British Mandate for Palestine, 1920 to 1948. David Margolick once suggested that epic sports stories, worth immortalizing in a book, are in short supply, with events like the Nazi Olympics pretty much picked clean. This is one story that has been mysteriously left on the bone. Complicated and purposefully concealed or forgotten, the history in this book sometimes raises more questions than it provides answers. I believe that the Munich Massacre, in which 11 Israelis, 1 German policeman, and a number of Palestinian attackers died at the Games of the 20th Olympiad in 1972, is the reason for the story's obscurity. If Munich had not happened, I suspect that the story would have been told a long time ago. Its time has arrived. 2. I constructed this book with alternating segments that present the actions of the two camps, Jewish and Arab national sport, with the Jerusalem Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, representing the organizational interests and competency development of the latter camp. I introduce 3 main characters in the order that I perceive them to be chronologically and historically important to the corresponding national sport files. Yosef Yekutieli is arguably the most important person in the history of Jewish and Israeli sports, as both the founder of the Maccabee Games, historically considered the Jewish Olympics, and the architect of Mandate Palestine's earliest, internationally recognized, national sport governing bodies, the Federation of the Amateur Sports Clubs of Palestine, FASCP, and the Palestine Olympic Association, POA. His colleague, Friedrich Kish, is in some ways incidental, except that he was the political figurehead of the Palestine Olympic body and an extremely important figure of the time, so much so that members of the International Olympic Committee considered his joining its board before the Second World War. Without Kish in the role of president in 1934, the IOC could never have recognized the POA. In the case of Waldo Heinrichs Sr., he could have been more important in the history of Arab-Palestinian sport and Mandate Palestine, if not for his unfortunate removal in a Nazi campaign reinforced by some of the Christian Arabs on the board of the Jerusalem YMCA. Yet, it is in Heinrichs that we see more than anyone else the stance that sound principles count for something in this world, and that if we stick to them, we can alter the course of history. That, along with his long covered-up story, is why I chose to weave him throughout the book, even though he was in Jerusalem for barely 2 years. 3. People who would eventually become very senior Israeli government officials after the establishment of the State of Israel had affiliations with the Maccabee sports movement. It was Yekutieli who drew for them the movement's logo sometime between the Stockholm Olympic Games of 1912 and the restructuring of the Maccabee movement in 1921. Using a pencil and a sheet of carbon copy paper, he took the 4 letters of the Hebrew word Maccabee, a mim, kaf, vet, and yod, and fashioned them into the Star of David, what the Jewish community refers to as the Magen David, or the Shield of David. In ancient times, King David carried a 6-pointed shield into battle. The modern Maccabees adopted this symbol as a reflection of their disciplined commitment to Zionism and readiness to defend Jews. Maccabee sport clubs around the world still wear Yekutieli's logo as a badge of honor, whereas the Nazis purposely took the Shield of David and tried to make it a mark of shame. It is not a star, but a deep connection to an ancient Jewish military history. Since the Shield of David is a relatively recent symbol for Jews in the religious and political sense, religious scholars are not certain who introduced its association as a unifying symbol for and of Jews. But there is no doubt that Yekutieli saw in it a form around which the Jewish sports movement could unite. In his pamphlet, The Jewish State, Theodor Herzl described how it was the condition of the diaspora, the dispersal of the Jews from their historic land and disconnection from one another, that prevented them from conducting their political affairs for themselves. On November 24, 1895, more than 1 year before the First Zionist Congress, Herzl presented his strategy for a Jewish state to the Order of Ancient Maccabeans, an Anglo-Jewish friendly society and avowedly Zionist order. He won the order's support for his plan. Major figures were associated with this order. Its grand commander was Herbert Bentwich, whose son Norman became a close associate of Kish. Other major figures in the order were Chaim Weizmann, Israel's first president, and the renowned mathematician Zelig Brodetsky, who became the president of the Maccabee World Union after it moved from Germany to London because of the rise of Nazism. It is based on these connections, and for these reasons, that one can find Zionist and Jewish leaders who were associated with the Maccabee movement writing books like President of Israel Chaim Herzog's Heroes of Israel, Profiles of Jewish Courage. In this book, modern Israeli leaders are profiled with ancient Jewish leaders, including Judah, the Maccabee, the Hammer, who led a critical campaign of the ancient Maccabean wars against the Seleucids. These wars lasted from 167 to 37 BCE. The war's end took place in the final defeat of the last standing Jewish fortress at Beitar in the Bar Kokhba revolt. The torch-lighting ceremony for the Maccabee Games occurs at the site of the Hasmonean tombs in Modi'in. The Hasmoneans were the Jewish dynasty that led the revolt against the Romans, and Modi'in, where they are buried, is their ancestral town. It would be a mistake to interpret this history as mere propaganda, even though it has been used to coalesce a modern Jewish identity for state-building. For early Zionists especially, this was simple history. Their mission as a group was to reveal it to Jews who, in the words of Max Nordau, Herzl's close associate who inspired the Maccabee movement with his concept of muscular Jewry, had rabbis who expunged from prayer books what has become to them a meaningless hope: next year in Jerusalem. To leaders like those in the order of ancient Maccabeans, the ancient Maccabean wars were fought specifically to preserve Jewish identity against what was seen as an increasingly assimilated, Hellenistic, Greek, Jewish culture. Zionism sought to reverse assimilation, but not based on ancient religious perceptions. Rather, it was an antidote to the very real problem of anti-Semitism faced by the Jews in Europe and the diaspora. There are many ideologies within Zionism, and it would be inappropriate to overstate the Maccabees' power within the state today or within the broader global Jewish community. But the Maccabees were very important in that they gave a broad Jewish emotive connection point to Zionism that helped enable its business strategy and political structure in a way that still binds so many Jews together, even if they are not Israelis. To say that Zionism is one thing, racism, Nazism, apartheid, colonialism, and so forth, is oversimplification to the extreme, as well as ignorant, which is why the charge of anti-Semitism is leveled against such statements. This language can be very harmful, even if it is a reaction to the very distressing facts of life for Palestinians today. Statecraft is perfectly legitimate in today's global order, even if its tactics are morally abhorrent to some, and the affairs of states, or states in formation, are highly complicated as well as subjective. For this reason, it is important to stress that the Maccabee movement was never exclusively Jewish. It simply has always been centered on and inspired by Jewish identity, and its primary clientele is Jewish youth. There is nothing exceptional or nefarious about Jewish sport organizing itself globally, or in Mandate Palestine historically. This is how everyone in sport arranged their affairs, especially before the Second World War. Communists formed communist clubs. Greek Orthodox formed Orthodox clubs. Muslims formed Islamic clubs. The military had military teams, and so on. Sport, from its inception, has been organized on an identity model much like nations. Acknowledging the constraints of that model, it's probably better to have these groups let off steam on the field of play instead of on the battlefield. This was a central desired outcome of Coubertin's Olympic ideal. Despite the legitimate critique of some of its shortcomings, the Olympic movement has broken down a lot of the identity model historically present in sport, even though it also struggles to manage some within its ranks who promote national identification excessively. 4. The Zionists' muscular Judaism was preceded by its Christian version, muscular Christianity. This found its fullest expression in the global network of YMCAs. Although the YMCA movement did not seek to build specifically Christian nation-states through its activity, muscular Christianity perceived sports as a source of moral education and a moral code of honor based on sportsmanship. Humphrey Bowman was the chair of the board of directors of the Jerusalem YMCA during our story and promoted such an ideal. He was also the director of the education department for the government of Palestine. He presided over two entities, one governmental and one non-governmental, that sought to unify the communities through education and sport. Thus, Jewish and Christian sport movements were emulating one another, albeit through different identity and value lenses. It should come as no surprise that the Muslim inhabitants of Palestine would follow suit. In 1926, in Egypt, a Young Men's Muslim Association was founded. Its branch in Haifa, Palestine, was headed by Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, the Syrian sheikh who emigrated to Palestine in the early 1920s and tried to organize a peasant revolt. This picture demonstrates that all major actors were utilizing sport to assert identity and express political ambitions, a fact that must be recognized in order to digest the story in the file. The key differentiating factor between the Jewish, YMCA, and non-Jewish Palestinian sport movements as it related to Olympic affiliation was the degree to which any of them was willing to suppress some of the more overt private agendas and adopt the IOC's internationalist agenda, which insisted that Olympic governing bodies work across ethnic and religious lines. As the three camps fought it out in the early 1930s and petitioned international sport for membership, the international system would have an increasingly hard time sorting it all out. Even the IOC would be confronted by its own leaders gravitating in one direction or another. In 1920, the International Committee of YMCAs, IC/YMCA, reached out to the IOC at the Games of the 7th Olympiad. At an appearance before the committee in Antwerp, Elwood Brown, who was the director of physical education for the IC/YMCA, presented a plan to collaborate with the IOC. Back then, it was actually the YMCA that had the more global reach and was leading the way in the development of sport outside of Europe, especially in Asia. Brown extolled the virtues of the YMCA's promotion machine. It had nearly 100 trained physical directors in 25 countries, and its work was in harmony with Olympic standards. He argued that the YMCA could quickly increase the number of countries for sending qualified competitors to the quadrennial contests. While the IOC organized the Olympic Games, it was the YMCA that was organizing sport at the continental level. This gave the YMCA real power and influence. Brown gave 3 examples of the YMCA's work in organizing regional or continental games: the Far Eastern Games, the South American International Games, and the Indian Empire Games, which later became the British Empire Games and then the Commonwealth Games. In the case of all 3 games, Brown stressed that all of the promotion work was done by the YMCA. He asked the IOC to consider 6 suggestions, including that the Far Eastern Games be recognized by the IOC and incorporated into its global program. More importantly, for the file, Brown wanted the IOC to work with the YMCA movement to invite countries which are not represented on the International Olympic Committee and have never sent an athlete to the Olympic Games to send 1 or more observers to the 1924 Games in Paris. Although he did not specifically reference Palestine, we begin to see movement in the file around the Paris Games, first by Maccabi Palestine. By 1930, the Jerusalem YMCA also asserted itself as a representative of Palestinian Olympic interests, and the Maccabees and Zionists engaged the association and Arab sports constituents that it represented to form a Palestine Olympic Games Association, POGA. Such associations characterized some of the early Olympic activity around the world. They would convene before an Olympic Games to handle the administrative and financial requirements associated with sending a team to the Games. Unfortunately, the POGA never came to fruition. This context of failure is critical to understanding why Waldo Heinrichs was so important to a Palestine Olympic initiative. It might also explain why he was targeted by the Nazis. Chapter 1. Soldier Sons. Exactly 40 years before the Munich Massacre, 3 men would begin cooperating on the formation of a representative national sport governing body for Palestine. 2 were ardent Zionists. The third, a Christian who was deeply religious by nature, yet equally radical on social progress. All 3 had served in the First World War, formidable heroes and personalities in their own right. All 3 loved sports, each dedicated to its practice irrespective of race, creed, or nationality. Their conversations appear to have caught the attention of the darker, emerging forces of the 1930s. In the ongoing efforts to defeat the boycott campaign against the 1936 Berlin Games and admit Palestine to the International Olympic Committee, a veritable cesspool of charges, collusion, and intrigue emerged from a Nazi cell that became active in Jerusalem in the lead-up to the Games. Although defeated in war, the legacy of the Nazis' actions seems to have affected Olympic history for decades. So deeply rooted was the Arab refusal of cooperation with Jews on joint sport governance, Olympic or otherwise, that it altered the course of sport history. This is a cautionary tale about what could have been in sport, told for the benefit of all those who seek to learn from the past and yearn for a more positive future on the field of play. Everyone is an ideologue. What counts is how we control and share our ideologies. Time is a valuable lens through which we can better understand our past and try to change course for the future. The time has arrived for an Olympic truce in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Yosef Yekutieli, the Maccabee Soldier. It was mid-1934, and the world was tumbling toward new darkness. The innovation to the Games of the 11th Olympiad in Berlin finally arrived at P.O. Box 129, Tel Aviv, Palestine. But this invitation was special. It had the attention of Hitler's Reich Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. To open, or not to open? The president of the Olympic Committee and his honorary secretary, Yosef Yekutieli, discussed how to respond. Rumors were already circulating in the press that the president had come to some type of arrangement with senior Nazi officials, and he wanted the matter cleared up. Some saw Yekutieli as an angel of God, destined to bring the light out from the east and shine it on this dark world. It was his purpose. It was why he was born. Swarthy and rough-hewn, he was the sage of the Maccabee Jewish sports movement in British Palestine, armed with a volley of inspirational words meant to pierce the hearts of Jewish youth. He would now direct his arrows at the International Olympic Committee for what he perceived to be its failure in its duty to withdraw.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?